Hello and welcome back to the OSM channel. You're currently looking at my Echo SRM 225 Weed Whacker, and I've had this unit for about 5 or 6 years now, and honestly it's been a fantastic unit, especially for what these things cost. Now, I've been pretty terrible with the maintenance of this unit. I never empty out the fuel out of the tank, I never empty out the carburetor at the end of the season, and I think I'm kind of paying the price now, but we're going to get that fixed up. So the issue I'm having, I like to edge my garden beds, and when I go to flip this unit upside down while it's running, or hold it on awkward angles, fuel's leaking out of the unit. And what that could be, it could be several different things. You could have a cracked fuel tank, you could have cracked fuel lines, the grommet where the fuel lines enter and exit the tank could be dry rotted and failing, but that wasn't the case for me. Where the fuel seems to be leaking out of it, it seems to be leaking from the carburetor back into the air filter, and then it drips from the air filter housing. So, this unit has something called a diaphragm carburetor, and a diaphragm carburetor is the type of carburetor that would be on a chainsaw or these small two-stroke engines, and basically it allows you to run the engine in any position, right side up, upside down. So, of course, I haven't been the best with maintenance of this unit, and the fuel these days, you know, ethanol isn't great for these small diaphragms and whatnot. So what I highly suspect is that we have a damaged or broken component inside this carburetor. Now they do sell, I'd imagine they sell rebuild kits, but for what a tune-up kit costs these days, I mean, this tune-up kit costs under $15. I think that's the route to go. So in today's video, we're going to do a tune-up of this unit. We're going to replace the carburetor gaskets, air filter, spark plug, and also the fuel lines that enter and exit the tank. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is unthread this cap for the air filter housing. See what the air filter looks like. Wow, that's pretty bad. As you can see, I can actually feel that this is damp down here. So if I turn the unit upside down, you can see that fuel's dripping right out, and it's coming right from in here, so that's no good. Next, on the top side of the carburetor, I'm going to disconnect the throttle line. So I'm going to take this black tab in between the carburetor and the engine housing, push this towards the pull cord. Utilizing a pick, I'm going to pop this little wire up and out of this slot. Can release that tab. And there's also a 10mm fastener attached to what looks like a brass looking tube. So we're going to crack this, just spin this silver nut. We're not going to mess around with the other brass looking nut. So now we can go ahead and kind of turn this out of the way. Moving back to the air filter housing, we're going to remove these two T27 fasteners. Next, we need to pop this rubber grommet that goes into the fuel tank out of the fuel tank. And now we should be able to remove the air filter housing, carburetor, and fuel lines all in one shot. Now I'm going to carefully wipe off the surface of where these new fuel lines, the fuel line grommet is going to be inserted into the fuel tank. Now I'm going to go ahead and install these new fuel lines and grommet. Also, something important to note, the long line that is attached to the fuel filter, which is going to be this black line you want closest to the engine. Now, typically I don't like to use screwdrivers when reinstalling these, but this is just such a tight fit that I don't think I have any other option here. I got that grommet in there off camera. It's going to take a lot of persistence. Just be patient, and I don't know, you're really going to have to use a flathead screwdriver, unfortunately. But anyway, it's in there, nothing's damaged. What I'm going to do now is just clean up the engine a little bit, being very careful not to get any debris inside the carburetor there. Now we can remove this gasket on the engine. So we're getting close to the point where we're ready to install the new carburetor onto the engine. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to remove the old air filter housing. We're going to reuse this, but I'm taking this off the old carburetor. There's a bit of schmutz on it, so I'm just going to clean this up a little bit real quick. Now that I have the air filter housing all cleaned up, it's ready to be mounted onto the new carburetor. Now I will note that there's no gasket in between this air filter housing and the original carburetor, so I'm gonna keep it the way it was. Now this new carburetor kit included 2 gaskets. I'd imagine one gasket is going to go right here. Obviously this gasket goes here. But as for the second gasket, I was trying to determine whether that went in between the air filter housing and the carburetor. Where I actually think this goes, I think it goes in between this plastic block and the engine. I don't think there's any problems with that gasket, so I'm just going to discard this gasket for now. But as for this gasket, this is definitely going to need to go in between this plastic block and the new carburetor. So if we take the new carburetor, it's going to go onto the engine like so. So we'll simply take this gasket, transfer it onto the bolts of the new carburetor. We'll go ahead and start threading this into the engine. Now that the air filter housing and carburetor are tightened to the engine, we need to install the fuel lines. So there's going to be 3 fuel lines. One is going to have a plastic white cap. That's going to be our vent. Our black line is going to be our intake, and the clear line is going to be the return. So the black intake is going to go onto the barb on the carburetor closest to the engine, and the return is going to go on the barb closer to the air filter. So I'm having a little bit of difficulty installing these lines. The lines don't want to go all the way up the barb, so I have the heat gun, and we're going to heat these up in a moment here. But another important thing I want to note is that these lines were a little bit long. And the issue is, if you try to put these on the barb while they're long, you could potentially create a kink in the line. So what I did, I measured mine out and I trimmed a little bit off the top of the lines, just so that when these lines go completely up the barbs, there's going to be no kinks in the supply and return line. So let's get a heat gun. We'll put a little bit of heat on these, and then we'll try and slide them up the barbs. Now those lines were a little bit tricky to get on. I found that the return line went on that barb a lot easier, but as for the fuel supply line, that was a little bit tricky, but it's done now. As for this check valve, this vent line, I'm going to zip tie this underneath the air filter housing, and I'm going to zip tie this to the return line. You definitely don't want this flopping around, because if you have it flopping around when you go to pull a pull cord, you run the risk of pulling off that check valve, so we don't want that. So yeah, let's reinstall this throttle line. So the first thing we're going to do, where this brass looking nut is, there's a little slot for it right here. So we're going to slide this down in here like so. And if you do need to make a throttle adjustment, you would simply lift this up, spin that nut clockwise or counterclockwise, depending on which way you need to adjust your throttle. And that's how you would adjust the throttle. And we'll take our 10 mil and we will lock down this nut. And now we need to reinsert the throttle cable back into this slot. So what I'm going to do, taking the black tab, push this forward, reposition this slot so that I can drop the line in, push the line down into this slot, like so. Let off the pull tab. There we go. It's also important to note that the little stopper at the end of the throttle cable is received into this slot right there. And also this is your idle adjustment screw, so if you do need to make an adjustment, that's where that is as well. Now we can reinstall the air filter. And the outside of the air filter housing, and we will thread this back in. So we're almost complete. Up to you if you want to change out the spark plug. I'm going to go ahead and do it while I have everything on the table here. You know, the spark plug actually looks pretty darn good, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to reinstall this and then I'll save that new spark plug in case I need it at a later date. All right, now the moment of truth. Let's see if this new carburetor fixed our leaking issue. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to hit the prime bulb several times. See fuel coming in. Get this engine primed. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to repeat the test I did earlier. So I'm going to flip this upside down. I don't see one drop of fuel yet, so that's a good sign. I think we repaired our issue, but to be sure, let's go outside, start this engine up, and make sure that we don't have any other issues. Now, a final note, the carburetor I purchased was set a little bit lean, meaning that it wasn't providing enough fuel to the engine. In order to adjust that, if you look beneath the fuel ball, you'll see that there's a very small brass flathead screw. If you want to create a richer burn, meaning more fuel going to the engine, you would turn this counterclockwise. If you want to cut off the fuel going to the engine, creating a leaner burn, then you would twist this clockwise. Now, if your engine is running too rich, it will sound pretty groggy. There'll be a lot of smoke coming out the exhaust. On the flip side of that, if your engine's running too lean, when you squeeze the throttle, it'll have trouble coming up to full RPMs, and it'll sound like it's starving for fuel. So now, if your carburetor isn't set just right, you will have to play around with this adjustment screw, but it's fairly easy to get it tuned in. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Thanks for watching. As always, I will catch you on the next one.